Welcome everyone to the first colloquium in this semester, and it's the first colloquium we are going to have in the webinar mode. I'm Chandan Gowda. I'm faculty at APU. I'm really happy to welcome M Krishna to give the talk this afternoon. Welcome him back. He's given a talk here a few years ago in 2014, as we just discovered. About the talk was about his first book, or the first book that he has authored by himself. He's co-authored a book before that. This book was a Southern Music. This talk today, I think, will also be based on another book that is written recently, Sebastian and Sons. M Krishna is, as you all know, is a Carnatic vocalist, but he has a deep intellectual interest in the institutional dimensions of music and its relation to other art forms as social institutions. And he has posed difficult questions to the institutional keepers of the tradition, as it were. In recent years, he's also raised questions pertaining to the environment and a range of human rights issues, if you want to use that broad umbrella term, but it's really an important voice in India's political discussions. His talk today is titled, "We Are the Music Makers." Krishna, over to you.
Thank you, Chandan, and thank you for having
Krishna,
me.
Before you start, let me quickly tell the audience, after Krishna's lecture, you'll have a chance to ask your questions. You'll have to write them out in the chat box, and we'll take them one by one. Sorry about that. Krishna, please.
No problem, no problem. Thank you, Chandan. Thank you for the introduction, and it's good to be back at Azim Premji University, though in remote mode. Thank you very much for enabling this. I was supposed to come, I think, in March when everything kind of went south as far as public life goes. So today's conversation is going to be based on, well, this book, Sebastian and Sons, which was published early 2020. In fact, it was released just about a month before we went into lockdown. There may be people here who are not familiar with, shall we say, the landscape that is discussed in the book. So I'm just going to give you a kind of a overview of the landscape. So those who are already aware of it, please pardon me for being repetitive. So Carnatic music, very simply put, is one of the, within quotes, classical music traditions of India, and I put it within quotes because I don't believe in that word. But Carnatic music, Khyal, Hindustani music, which is an umbrella term for Khyal, Drupad, are the two very prized art forms of the country, elite art forms of the country, showcased across the globe, showcased by us as being, shall we say, the bastions, the baskets, the representatives of what is Indian culture, and that whole notion of antiquity and oldness, all attached to it. Everything else that goes with it, the whole baggage. And Carnatic music has been practiced for many hundred years. What you hear is Carnatic music today. Though people will tell you everything is 2,000 years, don't believe them. Carnatic music, as you hear it today, can be traced in practice to about 200 years. In theorization, pushing it further by maybe a couple of hundred years. So this is how I'll place it. This is, of course, very reductionist, to just keep it easy. Why did I write this book? Chandan did speak about my previous book called Southern Music, The Carnatic Story, which was an overview of the aesthetics, the history, the musicological background to the art form called Carnatic music, its sociological practice, its relationship with other art forms. I mean, it was a collection of about 24 essays that told you the entire story to the best of my abilities. And it was curious that there's a whole chapter on caste, about the whole complication of how caste and culture are so intertwined. And, culture is one of those very amorphous words that none of us actually know the meaning of, which is why we generally avoid grappling with it. And, what do we feel about culture? It's just something that is felt, something that is inside. There's a pride attached to it if you have any kind of privilege. If otherwise, if you come from a section of society where your culture is demeaned, is marginalized, your being is ignored, then there is this whole notion of flaunting your culture is not something that you do. In fact, you probably change your behavior, change your practices. There's a certain aspiration that is involved. All these ugly things happen in within this domain of the word culture. And so I write this book called The Southern Music, and about the whole topography of Carnatic music in that. And a few months after it was published, when we were reviewing the book for corrections and changes, I noticed that in the entire book, there was not even a mention of the people who make the instruments that we play and we flaunt and we celebrate on stage. And this deeply bothered me because I realized that, discrimination, or the thought of discrimination, or the sub-thought of discrimination, of ignoring. And I'm using discrimination not in terms of only its overtness, but the fact that you don't see something is itself a sample of a discriminative thought process or cultural process. I had not seen the instrument makers in this discourse at all. And I thought it was important for me to engage in that world. Now, you could ask me, why mridangam makers? Sebastian and Sons is the story of the people who make the mridangam. The question is, why the mridangam? Why not the veena? Why not the violin? And there is a specific reason why. Actually, two reasons. One, unlike, say, a tambura or a tanpura, if I go and buy a tambura today, I buy it, I pretty much maintain the instrument. Therefore, my relationship with the instrument maker stops pretty much there. It's almost transactional. It's like going to a shop. I buy it from the maker and I come back and then I change the strings myself. Unless there is something drastically wrong with it, I don't go back for any kind of service or any kind of support to the maker. This is as true of the violin. It needs very little communication, constant communication and interaction with the makers of the violin. The mridangam or the tabla or the pakhavaj are not the same. They are instruments that constantly need change, need, shall we say, reinvention, parts replaced, tuning, and it's very, very specialized. This means that the relationship between the maker and the player is far more constant, intimate. There is naturally a emotional bond, all being played out with the mridangam being, shall we say, the catalyst, the conduit through which this conversation between these two people are happening. Now, in the case of the mridangam, this becomes furthermore complicated because the two people who are having this relationship, this conversation, do not come from the same position in society. The mridangam player, most of the times, 99.9% of the times now, is a Brahmin. There are some from another community called the Isebellalers, but far fewer nowadays. I would stick my head out and say probably 99.9% of mridangam players today are Brahmins. The mridangam maker is usually from a Dalit community. A lot of mridangam makers are Christians, Dalit Christians. Whether you go to Karnataka, whether you go to Kerala, whether you go to Andhra Pradesh, which is pretty much the bandwidth of where you find mridangam makers, because the art form also flourishes in these areas, they are mainly from marginalized communities. They are most of the times men. I will talk about the exceptions, but most times men. And there are a couple of Brahmins who are also making it, which is also an interesting conversation to have. They also feature in the book. So here there are these two communities, rather these two specific subsets of communities who are having this relationship over an instrument or because of an instrument. Now, why is this relationship there? One of the primary reasons that you have this disparity of caste separating them in this case is because this instrument requires hide, skin work. And whenever skin work is involved, the community that handles that work comes from marginalized sections of society because of this ugly notion of purity that pervades not just mridangam, but our entire social structure. The mridangam, to give you a very quick rundown uses three kinds of skin: cow skin, buffalo skin, goat skin. The wood, rather the frame, is usually made of jackwood tree. The people who make the frame are different. So, and there is a chapter on them, but this book focuses on the people who make the instrument, which means that they buy the frame from the asaris, as they are known. That's a different community. And they're the ones who are the carpenters and do other woodwork. They buy the frame from them with specifications. And then they go to the abattoir. They choose, at least in case of cow for sure, they choose the kind of cow that has to be slaughtered, meat being used for consumption, and the skin is used for the instrument. Buffalo skin, goat skin. Bring all this together in a very complex process of making. Now, this very same instrument is kept in the puja room of every Brahmin mridangam player. And the essential incongruousness, the whole complexity and how this whole notion of purity and impurity plays out is being played out through this instrument, the making of the instrument, and in the people who make the instrument. In fact, I kept using the word mridangam makers. The often heard word actually is repairer. You never hear most mridangam artists calling them makers. They'll say, I need to go to the repairer's shop. So they're not even considered the makers of the instrument. Now, the whole process of the book came from 4 years of primarily field work. The book comes from talking to over 40 or 50 mridangam makers, 40 mridangam makers, I think, from different regions, and also mridangam players, about 10 or 15, many of them very senior who have seen the history of it. And it traces where this whole process of making came from, who started it, what is their social history, what is their political history. It centers itself around the Tanjavur mridangam makers. Now, like in playing the mridangam, you have multiple styles. In the making of the mridangam, there are multiple styles and banis and gharanas, as they say. So there is one style that is Tanjavur style. You have one style that is Madras style. You have Kerala makers who are primarily, the main family is found around Palakkad, near Palakkad, in a village near Palakkad. Then you have Andhra makers situated in two regions, either Vijayawada or near Vizag, Vijayanagara. Now, every one of them have their own ways of making. So the book looks at the different ways, but primarily traces the Tanjavur tradition, because they are the most dominant and they're most well known. Now, it's not like many families in Tanjavur from this community make the mridangam. The mridangam is made by pretty much one extended family. And the extended family, in that extended family, the person who I have traced as being probably the first mridangam maker is Sebastian. In Tamil, we call him Sevittian, Sebastian. And that is why the book is Sebastian and Sons. Sebastian is probably one of the earliest ever mridangam makers that we have. You can trace him to the early 20th century. His father used to make the tawil, the other instrument used with the Nadaswaram. But it is Sebastian who completely shifted schools and made the mridangam in Tanjavur. And then the family and the extended family, well, I have the chart right here, on my wall. There are about 30 makers, only 35 makers in that family living in Madras, living in Tanjavur, in villages, in different places. This is the book. Now, the book also looks at multiple things. I mean, I already touched upon the notion of skin and purity. It's a very important idea that is propagated in this book on how the Brahmins, I mean, these are the same community, the same people who will tell you that about the greatness of the cow, about the fact that eating meat is somehow lesser. It's the same kind of people who will talk about the purity of the instrument. Pray on Saraswati Puja every year. The mridangam is kept in the puja room and prayed to. And it's also an irony that it's called Nandi's instrument, where Nandi's Nandi is bovine, and that skin is used for this instrument. So you have a lot of mythology that is created by the playing community to kind of do things. One, distance themselves entirely from the making process. Two, also create a sense of purity. For example, I've heard stories saying that the cow actually prays that when it is killed, its skin is used for the mridangam. And somehow that means that it is actually got, probably, I'm just extrapolating, probably mean that the cow gets moksha. So these kind of myths are created to create a justification for the use of cow skin. And that's the very, very sensitive point. Often you will hear mridangam players saying, no, but we don't kill an animal just for the skin. It's anyway being hacked for meat, therefore we use it. One, this is not entirely true. I've said this 100 times in public discourse over the last 8 months, but I can tell you, I still see one comment or one person coming and saying, no, we use just skin of dead animals. So let me clarify this, and let me tell you that all that I'm saying is not my knowledge. I'm going to talk about knowledge, but it's everything I've learned from speaking to mridangam makers of multiple generations and traveling with them. So I am only here a bearer of what I've learned from these incredible artists. So I want to say that before I say anything else. So first, in the case of the cow skin especially, because the cow skin is a crucial part to how the mridangam sounds. I don't know how many of you have seen the mridangam. The side that you often see from the audience, you can go to YouTube as I'm speaking if you want. The side that you will see from offstage, you will see kind of two circles, and the outer rim that you see, which looks whiter in general, is cow skin. The center will be a black spot. I will talk about it, but behind that black spot is actually goat skin. So you have goat skin with a hole in, goat skin, cow skin on top, and there is center hole made on the cow skin, exposing the goat skin to the surface. Below these two is a support layer, support kind of skin frame, which is buffalo skin. So all these three are what make the side that you see from the audience. This is tied in the olden days, or at least till 15, 20 years ago, with buffalo skin to the other side, which is made of buffalo and goat skin. The exposure of the goat skin is much larger on the unseen side. I just give you a quick, basic pointers on how it's made. Now, makers are very specific about the kind of goats, kind of cows that are used, especially cow. They will tell you that you cannot use what they call Delhi cows. Or I presume they're also talking about non-native cows. So they even now source cow skin from Tanjore area. This is true of even makers, many makers who are also in Palakkad or in some other regions. So the cow in Tanjore is considered the best for creating wonderful resonance on the instrument. Two, it's not just any cow out of the Tanjore cow. On a Friday or on a Saturday, when cows are hacked, especially in small towns, it's not every day. You don't have a big abattoir. These people go there and choose the cow. That is. Similarly, the goats are not any goat. Specifically, they're actually, many of them are mountain goats from Andhra hills. And if you go to a place called Ambur, which is on the route actually from Chennai to Bangalore, very well known for biryani. If you are a lover of biryani, Ambur biryani is very famous. You have a lot of tanneries there. So wherever you have a lot of tanneries, you have abattoirs, and you have also people sourcing skin for instruments. And you will see that they will choose goat skin specifically. Sometimes they're looking for even markers on the skin. Are there dots on it? What color is their hair? So I just want to say that this is not some arbitrary thing. Secondly, if an animal died naturally, you cannot use that skin. This has to be understood too. Because when any animal dies, the process of clotting, according to the makers, affects the quality of the skin. So therefore, only if you hack or kill an animal, drain the blood out, will the skin have its flexibility and elasticity to be resonant. And this is the reason why you cannot just take any cow. Now, how old does the animal need to be? First of all the animals used on the mridangam are female, not male. And at least in the case of the cow, my understanding is it's got to do with the fact that females deliver. Now, when they do, the skin around the stomach becomes elastic, and that helps, again, resonance in the instrument. So they are not male, they're all female. Now, so in the case of the cow, they in fact look for a cow that has delivered at least twice or thrice. So the cow cannot be a calf, cannot be too young, it cannot be too old. So there are multiple layers. I just gave you these examples to tell you there's great specificity in the kind of skin that is chosen. So for mridangam players or those who feel very offended by the idea of an animal being killed for an instrument, I'm sorry. It's in this dichotomy that we need to kind of understand what is going on in our mind and why, and these ugly notions of purity and caste that actually are being played out even when we don't think they are being played out. So this is why fundamentally it's a complicated situation. Now, the makers have always been kept entirely to the background. Nobody speaks about them. There are few organizations that occasionally have now given a few awards, but that really doesn't mean much when there is no respect, when there is no recognition of their work. In fact, no mridangam player will ever speak about the blood. So one of the things I did as part of my field work was going with the makers to the abattoir, and we chose buffalo skin that day. And there's a chapter on it here, so I won't delve on it too much. But I just want to say that the beautiful sound that we think is divine starts with bloodshed, and in that seemingly contradictory sounds lies the reality of our own social behavior, our own social environment, our own understandings of purity. One mridangam maker told me, he said, the mridangam can enter the puja room and I cannot enter the puja room. But there have also been some fascinating movements. Before that, I want to say one more thing. This book is, of course, fundamentally a book about caste. But there is a problem in this book. And the problem is it's being written by a person with extreme caste privilege. It's also written by a man with extreme caste privilege. So I want to put that out in this conversation also, because you can ask that question, should M Krishna have written this book? And I think it's a fair question for us to debate, for me to debate and continue debating, not necessarily to find an answer to it. And the complexity here lies here, that however progressive, within quotes, liberal, caste-aware, caste-learning a person with that privilege is, you are still blind. You're probably going to be all your life. You just have to recognize that you're going to be always learning or willing to always learn. So are there things that I did not see? Are there things that I see only in a certain manner? All these are very much possible. All these are very much true. It is possible that in this book I have missed things simply because I am not emotionally and intellectually and socially there's this word multiple intelligences. So I was just trying to get that. So maybe I'm not socially, intellectually, emotionally, I don't have that multiple intelligences because of the privilege that limits me. And it's possible that I miss things. But it's important yet for me to engage with this and put this forward as a complicated discussion. And it's important that this complicated discussion is challenged and discussed. So I want to say this in this conversation because it's important, I think, for all of us who may be here with any kind of privilege having these conversations. Just want to tell you, I've never figured it out. That's the baseline where you have to begin this. So in the book, you will see me multiple times admitting to this truth. And the reason I put it out is because I'm also wondering. And there are two cases where something else just pops up and I say, oh my God, I didn't see it because I've never seen life in that manner. So I want to say that. There's another thing that is important to understand about the mridangam makers. Are they different, for example, from people of other Dalit communities? There is one complication that is probably missed often when people have discussed this book, is that the families of mridangam makers have a very unusual environment to live with. these families, not just occupationally, but in terms of their cultural connections, are entirely within the Brahminical ambit, bluntly the Brahmin ambit. So it's not just a question of making a mridangam and tuning it, or sitting with a mridangam player and making sure it's perfect for that person. I will talk about that. But it's also about the whole social environment is engulfed in that, right? So it's kind of a trap within a trap. So in a way, they're also separated from the larger, shall we say, Dalit discourses, from the larger, say, anti-caste discourses that are happening everywhere, right? Or even if they're engaged, there are severe limitations to how much they can engage in it in practicality of life. Not just because their occupation depends on the Brahmin maker, or Brahmin player, pardon me, but also because their whole cultural spectrum is around that circle. So it is a very, very isolating kind of a scenario to be in, or a scenario from which you can actually raise a voice culturally, economically, and politically, because that's the only thing, that's the only world, that's the only work that you are generationally taught. Of course, the present generation of makers, are younger people, are doing other things, but nevertheless, they will still tell you that this is their life, and there is something to the work that they do that they hold very close to their heart, in spite of the complexity of their lives. An important part of this book is the idea of knowledge, and I think I want to talk about that, because I think that's again something that people have not really understood. And it's fascinated me, and I've said this in the last few talks, about how offended Savarna commentators about this book have been about the fact that I have created an equivalence between the mridangam maker and the mridangam player. First, in this book, I don't create an equivalence in the sense of saying mridangam making is the same as mridangam playing. No. But the fact that that perception came out is very intriguing. And why should it bother somebody? I mean, these are people about whom we've not spoken about for 100 years. That has not bothered anybody. But the fact that I'm saying that the making is as sophisticated or an as incredibly nuanced and beautiful happening as the great things that you see on a stage and go, aha, or the creativity that you appreciate, is a different, these are two different worlds of intellectual inhabitation. Just that idea immediately bothers people, Savarnas, of saying you can't create this equivalence. I think that I think it's important to investigate that sudden fear or intellectual rejection that comes in. And of course, there are 100 explanations for it, and I'm happy to, shall we say, counter-argue every one of those explanations. But here is the important part. The idea of knowledge comes in. When is something knowledge? When is something not knowledge? So the whole, it's an epistemological question about how knowledge is constructed. How do we construct knowledge? When we construct knowledge, what are the facets to it that we believe need to be ticked for it to be considered knowledge? And most fascinatingly, one thing that we somehow require, or the caste privilege maker, caste privilege constructors and manipulators of knowledge require, is that knowledge somewhere distances itself from the body. So the more a certain work or a certain operation is connected with physical work, the less it is respected as a body of knowledge. This idea that the physical cannot be an active enabler, creator, constructor, learning mechanism of knowledge is something that we need to seriously explore. Because the moment something becomes more and more identified as a knowledge framework, the less and less it needs to be seen as something physical. And therefore, these words like artist, artisan, just if you look at all these words, and also experientially, it's very important on how we experience it. You experience something as less physical, then it's seen as more knowledge. You experience something as more physical, even as a viewer, then it is less knowledge. Then it becomes habit. Then seen as a repetitive act, seen as being just something that people picked up by making mistakes. The whole idea that there was learning and there is a certain way of communicating that learning that is non-verbal in that intellectual sense that is accepted is not even seen. So the whole knowledge or the mind of the mridangam maker is never seen. Therefore, this book goes through the every detailing of the mridangam making, the entire process, from the abattoir to the frame makers, to how it's tuned, to what is required, and every part of this is looked at. And the reason for me to go through that in almost 4 chapters for us to is to see that this is entirely a process of knowledge creation. And why don't we recognize it as knowledge creation? Of course, another attached conversation about this is the documentation, or the notion of writing knowledge vis-a-vis of not writing knowledge. So we are an unusual species, because we at the same time talk about intangible knowledge. Intangible heritage is a very often used word from the United Nations to our local bodies. But what are the intangible heritages? So is mridangam making ever going to be seen as intangible heritage? It's not been seen. And that's where, again, in this conversation, caste becomes an operative discriminative marker. So it's not just the physical, it's also the fact that in the caste hierarchy, we push the greater physical knowledge systems, if I can use that expression, or the body related, the tactile temporal knowledge systems down the caste ladder. And therefore, they are less and less seen as knowledge. And the mridangam maker, coming from pretty much the bottom of that ugly ladder, is not seen as a person or people or community with a mind, with innovation, with creativity. And often people said, no, there's nothing big about mridangam making. They just learned it through practice. And there's another interesting argument, that if they actually did not have that close relationship with a mridangam player who told them what he wanted, they could have never made it. This is absolute appropriation of the mind of people, appropriation of thinking, appropriation of just the beauty of innovation. And when I heard this statement as an argument, it deeply disturbed me. And the additional analogy used was the famous violin maker Stradivarius. And they said Stradivarius, of course, did not need any instrumentalist. So anybody who thinks Stradivarius made the instrument without actually having players to also play it and check it out and through a relationship must be honestly a fool. Because any instrument is tested through the player. But also doesn't mean that the player really knows what to do to make it the way he wants it. I'll tell you something about the mridangam making. When you go with a mridangam player to the mridangam maker's shop, the mridangam player will say, no, the weight is not right. I'm not getting my tone. The mridangam maker understands those words, understands how they translate to actual physical making, technical operations, and delivers it. So it's not just about making the mridangam, it's also about understanding these abstract concepts of music and finding a way for the mridangam player to actually translate that, because only if the sound is provided can the artist translate. And to also realize the difference between me as a mridangam player and you as a mridangam player. Every mridangam player cannot use the same instrument. So it's as complicated and as relationship oriented, but the mind and the creation is still the makers and still the mridangam makers. So this is also something I would like to stress on, the idea of knowledge. There is one aspect of this book that is not talked about. I wish it was talked about more. Is because caste is such a dominating aspect of this book, people forget that there is an entire section of the book about the gender in sound. And in fact, it has never been appeared in people who have argued for the book or critiqued the book or whatever. And that's something I want to touch upon before I open up for a discussion. So in the mridangam, I'm going to show you this picture again here. You see this black spot right at the center, right? Now, this black spot is of boiled rice, and a certain kind of stone. I have the stone right here for you. This is from Tanjore. No, well, this is from Tanjore. I think this is a similar stone from another region, Andhra region, called Tada. Anyway, these are the stones that you basically break, crush, grind. They have very high ferrous content. In fact, there, in the part of the book I discuss about their the material science about this. And they're applied with boiled rice like a paste on that center spot. Now, that's not only it. Now, if you look carefully here, if you don't know about the mridangam, and it's going to be hard to point, but I will try, you see this rim over here. Now, which means there are two layers. Now, so there's a gap between the two layers. The layer underneath layer is here, which is exposed, and the circumference layer is that. There's a gap in between. Now, in that gap, they usually put in either granules of this very stone or sticks. And this kind of grass, specific kind of grass, usually used also in the broom, and that's kind of put it in. And when you put it into that space, there is certain tonality that comes in. Now, there's been a very interesting transformation in what is considered respectable tonality in mridangam. All this has happened over the last 50 years. So when you put these stones in, the tone is what you could call not very sharp. So there's not a high lingering resonance. It's kind of blunter, but harder. So there is a certain machismo, manliness, toughness attached to the tone that comes with putting granules of this in that gap. If I put the sticks in, the sticks obviously will vibrate more. So the tones become sharper, actually usually far more appealing to many people. And that is taken to be a slightly lesser, actually cheaper tone. Now, I discuss in this book how the idea of the male and the female are being played out in this tonality. The tone with the granule is considered respectable. The tones with the sticks is considered to be just people pleasing, superficial, just fluffy, okay? And often they will tell you that the ones with this kind of tone are frequently used for women singers. But if you want a real respectable, manly, the word that is used often is gaurvamana tone, you use this. So it's very interesting that in this conversation is actually gender discrimination out there in sound. And it's important that we realize this. Often we don't realize that discriminative markers are actually aesthetic beings. And I'm using here aesthetic in a slightly larger general sense than aesthetics in what would be art sense. So how we perceive beauty, how we perceive something as acceptable, as non-acceptable, whether it's a sound, whether it is color, whether it is movement, many times is entrenched in caste gender discriminations. And this is a very classic example about how in sound we have decided what is male, what is female, and the male is considered respectable and something you go down to. The female is considered, yes, it's exciting, it is thrilling, but it is not respectable, not as respectable. So therefore, this book discusses this in great detail. People may ask me, just a few more things before I open it up. People may ask me, what about women makers? So mridangam making is primarily a male-dominated world. That's the truth. But there have been a few women who make the mridangam. Firstly, I must tell you, women always are part of the mridangam making process. Whether it is crushing the stone, which is very hard to do, it's done by the women in the house. Many times, the drying of the skin. You can't even imagine what it means to have fresh skin in your house. That you have to stretch it, you have to dry it. There's an entire process on how you cure the skin so that it becomes useful as a membrane for the mridangam. A lot of that is also done by the women in the house. But they are never the mridangam makers. Right? The entire process of putting all this together in an artistic sense. But There is one woman mridangam maker, and she is based out of Bangalore. She still lives there. Her name is Ashwatthama. She's a Brahmin. Her husband was a maker. So their story is an intriguing story about how they come to Bangalore and they enter a field which is actually objectionable to their community, and their struggles in getting acceptability within their family. And his wife then takes over and becomes a mridangam and tabla maker. Their shop is called Shanti Tabla Works. It's still there. You can just Google it, and if I know you guys are all in Bangalore, please do visit her. Her son would be there, so you can really go and learn directly from her and talk to her. So she is an exception to rule. And there are two women who again feature in the book who are people who supply the skin. One is a young woman, probably in her 30s, near Palakkad, and she is one of the main suppliers of cow skin, mainly buffalo skin, goat skin, in Kerala. Not just for the mridangam, but she also the skin of the bull for the chanda and for other instruments. And it was amazing to speak to her. And her story is also a very important part. Another lady, she is from Ambur. She was from, I think, near Salem, Rasipuram actually. And she moved to Ambur. She supplied a lot of the skin, especially goat skin, to the Madras, Chennai-based mridangam makers for decades. Now her son Kumar, her name is Madammal, her son Kumar is now taken over the business. And these are the exceptions to primarily it being a male-dominated environment. There's another argument. I'll end with this, that people have always in this question of why are mridangam makers not seen? Why are mridangam makers not respected? And you must understand that this book is about mridangam makers, but it's also about the entire world that we operate in. One of the things that was asked to me is, isn't this a supply chain issue? It's a very intriguing argument. That, I have a cell phone here. I know the name of the company that makes a cell phone, probably know a little bit more. But then if you go inside this system, if you go behind, I know the software makers, I know all the app makers, but as I go back, the disappearance or the invisibility of the people increases. So the simple question was, isn't this just a supply chain issue? I mean, the mridangam makers are not known because they are not seen. It's a very interesting question. But how is this whole supply chain operation itself built is what we don't ask. How much of that is also based on our social practices, on who are the people who are constantly pushed to the background or to those operations that are behind and not on stage. But there's another aspect here, which is far more complicated in making an instrument, is that resources or material, or shall we say minerals, for example, that are collected, or ore that is picked up, is very different than people who actually make the entire instrument in its whole complex structure, who are not seen, and they are not just suppliers of parts, but they are actually the makers of it. So there is a distinct difference, but yet even this whole supply chain, or how the capitalistic market works in terms of knowledge and education and access to that, is also something we should explore, extrapolating from this question and this environment that I'm discussing. And finally, before I end, I want to say that one of the things that many people keep on speaking about is mridangam players often speak about the making of the mridangam. And I can tell you without knowing anything about it. And I'll end with a quote of a mridangam maker who's no more. He said, "What do the mridangam players know about the making to ever speak about it?" I think I will end with that, and I will open the floor for discussion. Were there instances when the makers revolted and said, "We will play mridangam," or they didn't have any opportunities to learn, hence they couldn't revolt? Mridangam maker become mridangam player is itself an interesting postulation, right? So we are in a way conceding in that the mridangam making world cannot challenge the playing world from asking demanding a change in that relationship, a questioning of caste, and respect knowledge. So somewhere we are conceding that when we immediately ask about playing. So I think something that we should think about, which I find problematic, because I think it's also important to ask, shouldn't it happen there? Shouldn't we be asking that question there? Now to the mridangam makers playing, I will answer that. So have there been any mridangam makers who played the mridangam? Have they been trained formally? Hardly any. As far as I know, I've spoken to most mridangam makers. Few of them did learn, but they would themselves tell you that they could not go far in the learning process at all. And of course, caste is a major issue, and caste plays out, in many ways, not just in overt ways, right? It's always presumed that the maker, because he doesn't come from the background of music, will not be able to go beyond the point. Caste markers are seen from names. Therefore, opportunities many times are subconsciously gone, because if I heard a mridangam maker by the name Mukundan Ramanujam, and I heard another mridangam player by name Mukundan Ramanujam, and I heard there's another player called Arul Raj, it's anybody's guess who's going to get. Have played the mridangam for devotional music, for church music, for example. They've been played for church music, but mainly what they call light music orchestras. In fact, there was one well-known mridangam maker based in Chennai. His name is Krishnamurti. His son used to be a very well-known mridangam and tabla player in light music orchestra, the film music orchestra, to be more correct, and unfortunately passed away early. So they do play for devotional music, they do play for film music, but not within the world of Carnatic music. Were Dalit women involved in the making of the instrument? I think I kind of answered that question. That very few, but in the supplying of the skin, yes, women are involved, and in the work of the stone, crushing of the stone, support work at home, they are. And I think one of the reasons why there are less women who are makers is because it requires that much more handling of the skin. I mean, it's not a good argument, and I know it's not a good argument, but that's the argument that is made by the maker. They'll tell you it requires a lot of physical work. It's true, they have to, pull it, but they presume that the woman will not be able to do so much physical work. This is something that the mridangam maker himself will tell you. I'm shocked to look at details and truth behind mridangam making and the politics behind caste and gender of animals. What about children of makers? Okay, children of makers. Let's talk about now, presently. Many of them are, of course, also doing other things. One of them work in government offices, all that. But I want to tell you one thing: when they do other things, but they still have great pride in the fact that they create these instruments. They have great pride that they do new things. I can tell you recently, I remember, I think it was a month ago, a mridangam maker actually did a Facebook post of an instrument where he'd done an innovation and created a sound which was unbelievable. I called him and asked him how he did. He said, no, that's the quality of the skin. He got a tone without putting those sticks inside. And I was shocked. So I called him and I said, how did you do that? He said, no, that's got to do with the selection of the skin. If I get this kind of skin, cow skin, then I can get this tone even without any inserting any extra material between the membranes. So they have great pride in their work, and this is important. So and because of that pride, they also do this. So there is one person who works in the public health works department. He comes every evening at 5 o'clock to the shop and works. So here, shop is a very interesting idea. So I mean, there's a lot of things to discuss. I've just touched the surface. In those days, most mridangam makers worked in the homes of the players. So you can imagine the complexity in that relationship, in access, in where they worked. So from times when in the villages, like the makers themselves say, they used to work outside in the porch is where the access was. So the student would bring the mridangam outside, leave it there, and take it in for the master to see. They were not even allowed inside. The skin work is definitely not allowed inside. All these, and sometimes they will tell you about which door they could enter the home from. All these various things, right? And then what happens is, through a period of time, things change, spaces change, spatial changes. So what I want to say is that markers of what is acceptable, always being designed by people with caste privilege, keeps on changing. When they come to the city of Madras, then things become even more complicated, because many of the mridangam players are living in small homes. So these demarcations of which is the dining space, which is the kitchen, which is the hall, all kind of blur. So then there's more fluidity, more because of the context than anybody's real social awakening also starts coming in to these changes. One big shift that happened, and that happened because of the makers in the city of Madras and not the makers who came from Tanjavur and migrated here in the 60s, is that the idea of a workplace evolved. So the Chennai-based or the Madras-based makers worked out of a shop. In Tamil, they say kadai. And their workplace was defined. That actually changed the dynamics of the relationship tremendously, which meant there was a formalization of the space. They were not going to the homes of the players anymore. The players had to either themselves come or send their students or their stooges to the mridangam, to the shop. So that changed the whole dynamics of the relation to a large extent. And I think that also created a certain empowerment in this discourse, which was not there when they were, within quotes, at the service of the mridangam player. Is the process of tabla making same in terms of actual process? Different. The tabla uses mainly goat skin. There is a difference in process. It's in the book actually. They use what is known as it's secured skin. In Tamil they call it sunnambathol. First of all, it's always goat skin that is used for tabla. They don't use any other skin, and also they treat it with something that makes it thinner and increases resonance. That system is also used in the mridangam nowadays, but the making is very different. The daga is very different. First of all, there are two different bodies of sound. Therefore, the way the resonances happen are very different. So, yes, there is the interplay of hide is there, but the making system is very different. Is the religion and caste play hide and seek role when it comes to any kind of trade or type of profession which are considered? Oh, no doubt about it. I mean, this is a classic example of how caste is defining automatically who is in what profession, the limits of that person's social movement, limits of that person's political movement is defined by these markers. An interesting part is also religion here, right? Because many of them are Christian. And it is, I mean, I've always found it astounding with the kind of parochialism that you hear and the bigotedness you often hear within the Carnatic world about how this is Hindu music. You would, they should only sing on Rama, Krishna. And you go to every mridangam shop of the Tanjavur makers, and Mary and Jesus welcomes you, along with Ganapati and Rama. I mean, and the fact that we still don't learn from that, right? We still don't learn from that. I mean, just the wholeheartedness with which they coexist. They all go to Velangani. They all go pray in their churches. In fact, especially people who come from Tanjavur, the Dalit Christian community. They are the only Christians here. Any kind of social, their family event goes back to their village, goes back to their street, their home, and the church there. But they embrace Rama, they embrace Ganapati, they embrace Mary. And in spite of that, for us to sit here and claim this is Hindu music is quite ugly, bluntly put. And again, just a marker of religious and caste bigotedness. I'm sorry I'm saying it harshly, but I have no other easier way of saying that. Are the mridangam makers having work all around the year? Very good question. Because of caste and class levels, they are unable to explore spaces performing publicly what they create through pain, complexity, and knowledge. Okay, two things. One, yes, they do have work around the year. Like I told you, this is a constant happening. Say I buy a mridangam, hypothetically, or I get a mridangam made. Okay. That center black spot has been pretty much changed every 5 concerts. So every 5 concerts, the mridangam has to go back to the maker. And they call it sadam powder. Sadam literally means boiled rice. Okay, so they have to apply boiled rice is what it literally translates to, right? But this rice is entirely different. It's a black paste, so it has to go. Then after a period of time, the skin starts getting, as you start pulling it and you get resonance, it starts getting old. It starts sagging, very, very natural thing, which means tonality goes, which means the frame can be kept. So the frame of the mridangam is kept for 50 years, 60 years, 80 years, 100 years. and the wood is getting more and more like a cricket bat. The wood is getting more and more cured, but the skin itself needs replacement, what they call mootadikaradu. Now here there's another important thing is on how caste and these demarcators are often, shall we say, brushed under the carpet by the change in semantics. Now, what do I call skin in Tamil? Tol. I'm sure in Kannada it's also similar to that. Tol. Okay. When does the tol or skin of cow become an anga of or a part of an instrument? So for this transference to happen, multiple things happen. First, you need a person, in this case, the mridangam maker, to procure it, to cure it, to get it ready. And he is the bridge in this purification process. Because only after it's purified will you accept its existence. You also change the word. Once it is cut into a circle and made into shape and dried, it is not called tolu, it is called tatte. Tatte literally means plate, okay, because it's circular. So when the tolu becomes tatte, the impure becomes pure. And as tatte, it has the possibility of giving you divinity too. As tolu, it does not have that possibility. And the person who does this for you needs to inhabit that impure space in every aspect: social, physical, political space. And if the maker disappears, there's nobody to do this for you. So we have to also think of this very complicated happening that is part of this process. And now, question of publicly. I mean, there are two parts. One is also, let's also look at the practical thing. The making is not a performance art, right? The making is not something that happens on stage. But I singing or somebody playing the mridangam is something that is going to happen on stage. So there is a structural difference between the two. I mean, nobody is denying that. The question is, how does one create a society of equity, of respect, of knowledge, of people, where we challenge these caste-based divisions of the performance vis-a-vis the maker? Another thing you must remember here is, this is a very unusual case. If you go down the ugly caste framework, the differential between the social position of the maker and the player keeps on diminishing. So if you go down to, say, an instrument played by the Dalit community, it is the same person making it, especially if it involves skill. So here you have Brahmins who have decided to become mridangam players, right? But they can't be involved in the making of that skill. So therefore, you need the person at the bottom of that ladder to provide it. As the player comes down the social caste marking, then this gap keeps on diminishing, finally making both the same. We have to also see how this operates in this conversation. Has the process been videographed ever during your research? Yes, if you ask me that question, I have backups and backups, of course, because I don't want to lose it. I videoed every interview. I videoed the entire process of making. It was not done by one person, done through, you must understand that it's not possible to just do it over 10 days, right? So one part was done one period, another part, another period, and sometimes three mridangam makers were involved in it. The entire process is archived. I have it entirely. And I think it was a very important part for me was the videoing of every interview. I think that's a very important part of the book, because I revisited those interviews so many times. I saw the faces, I saw the expressions. I saw what were the inner meanings of many things that were said. That was possible only because I also videographed every interview. Yes, so it is all there. But making music on the mridangam is also a physical practice in itself. Very true, Maitri, but the question is, how much do we talk about it? That's the whole point. Singing is a very physical process, right? But you ask any musician, they'll say, yes, you have to practice a lot. But what will they talk about? Let's look at this jnana. You got jnana only because of work, because you sang, repeated one line for 10 hours is never discussed. So jnana itself is a way of distancing yourself from the actual physical act. So a lot of these elite art forms rarely talk about the physical as being a knowledge process. Physical is a technical process. I need to physically practice my voice so that my voice is good. But physical is a process of knowledge, is never talked about, right? It's only the intellectual part that is talked. Creativity, as it's seen as a physical thing? No. It is seen as a non-physical abstract thing. I will tell you, creativity is entirely a physical thing. As a singer, I will tell you. Only if I sang that same line 1,500 times will I be able to make a small change to it on the next occasion. So it's the physical repeating or recognizing that it's the same, a process the mind together. Okay, so yes, I mean this whole idea of which is superior. Now, even if you go to mridangam makers, the Tanjore makers, I mean that interplay is also very intriguing, right? They have great pride in their technique of making or the sound that they use. So the Tanjore makers will claim that they are the best. The Palakkad makers will tell you, we are the best. We have secrets we will not tell you. Each of them have their own trade secrets of the technique of making. The Andhra makers will tell you. So that's always there, which is better, even within the world of making itself. So, and there are nuances. I mean, there are nuances. I don't know, next time, I do hope. I mean, one thing, when people have read this book, they've said, when I've seen a mridangam next time, just on video, I see it differently. And I want you all to see it carefully next time. The rim of that frame is the most gorgeous braiding process I have seen. It'll be braided so sharply. And I can tell you that there are technique differences between how it is braided by the Kerala makers vis-a-vis the Tanjore makers. So, I mean, it's fascinating how those cut. And I want to tell you that it's not just skin. Which part of the bovine skin or the goat skin is used for which part of the instrument is also very specific. Okay, and it's very, very clear. So, I mean, people who eat meat know about the meat from the flank of a goat, right? I mean, where it's the softest. And I can tell you that that's used only for a specific thing in the mridangam play process. You need that softness. So there are many nuances there. Sir, did you have a background in music? If you did it help you in researching? I'm extremely happy that you don't know I'm a musician. But yes, I do have a background in music. I am a musician. I'm a singer. That is my primary domain of activity. Therefore, yes, it did help me tremendously in this work because I understood things. So I mean, that's a very important aspect of, I think, field work and research also. That you need to kind of jump into the entire culture of anything than just touch the surface if you really want to know the inner meanings of things that are communicated to you. Does the acknowledgement of Savarna positionality translate into the material either within or beyond your research? We Savarna narrate Dalit stories, but it is ultimately benefits our careers. This is the catch-22, Ranjita, isn't it? Of me doing something like this is, how does it change their lives? Well, I would like to believe that it has, and I don't want to go to the details of it because some of these things are work in progress. I could hear from the makers, and I'm only saying on that basis, has, of course, enabled a lot more conversations within them, a lot more empowerment and about the things that need to happen, and also in terms of at least we are seeing signs of economic changes, the signs of economic. I can use those, and which is good. I've seen a very distinct calling them the last 4 months. So all these things are you cut. Hello. Did I get cut, Chandan?
No. For a brief while, the voice faded. but that's probably a
Okay, that's
Wi-Fi
okay.
thing.
I'll just continue.
Krishna,
Yeah, but
we
my
noticed
wife
that
is
you're
on. I
looking
just
through
checked
the
it.
comment section. Krishna,
Yeah.
the comment section has many comments, and sometimes the same person has offered a couple of comments, questions. So on grounds of equity, we need to make sure
Okay,
everyone
so I'll move
has
to other
everyone
people.
had a
Okay.
chance.
Yeah,
No, no,
I
no, no,
got to
no.
look at
So
the name. Sorry. Okay, so I'm just.
no.
Can you just pop
Krishna,
it up for me? That's simpler.
that's what we'll do. That's what we'll do. I think.
Okay, let's go to the next then. I would let
Yeah.
you pop it up. Do we have gender discrimination regarding tabla? Yes. Gender discrimination regarding tabla and chamravadya. You're talking about sound related one. I'm not sure this intriguing aspect is there in the tabla sound. I don't know about it enough, so I'm not going to comment about it. So you need to ask somebody specifically, because to my knowledge, there are not these two distinct ways of adding a certain resonance that is there in the mridangam and the tabla, to my knowledge. So I don't think it is there. I do not think it exists. This kind of sonic gender discrimination, I don't think so.
No, not that one. This one.
How does the compatibility? Oh no. Okay.
Sorry, this is not coming up. Okay, let me read out the question for you, Krishna. How much time does it take to make a
Sure.
mridangam? And how much do they earn for each of this?
Question. It takes. Okay, so it depends on, first, are you asking for a mridangam for a basic learner, or asking for a professional? Order for mridangam schools, like, or for the states, for example. All this will determine the time and the effort that goes into making the instrument. If you buy a mridangam in, say, one of these music shops, I can tell you that they are not second, third grade, fourth grade mridangams, because they are not specialized for the individual. So suppose I'm a professional, let's start there, and I want a mridangam made. From buying first of all, if you include the wood processing or the wood curing time, that's about 3 months first, for the wood frame to be in a position to be bought by the maker. Okay, so that's about 3 months. So let's keep that aside. After the frame has arrived, let's presume that the maker has already procured and has stored enough hide of buffalo, cow, and goat. The process takes anywhere between 10 to 15 days. But for the sound from that new instrument to really, shall we say, flower, it sometimes takes longer. If it's made in an old technique, which now used less and less, because mridangam makers will tell you players want mridangam like that. They want to perform tomorrow with it. Then they use some other methods. There are some technical changes. If they use the old method of making, it may take at least 2 months after that of constant playing for the skin to, I mean, it's like a cricket bat, right? In the olden days, when you bought the cricket bat, you had to constantly hit the bat on a cricket ball and season it. So a certain seasoning process was there in the olden days. If you include that, it'll really open up as an instrument in about a month or so. It can cost anything from about 10 to 11,000 to 20,000 rupees for a good mridangam. Okay, anything between that. You can get cheaper mridangams if you are just a student, etc. So that's the general pricing. The cost of the wood is separate, but it's included in the cost that the mridangam maker is charging you. But I won't tell you, very much like the tech industry, if I can use a parallel. The making is not only where the maker makes the money; it's the servicing where there is a constant making. So any product you buy, you know that the actual you're paying for the service, right? So after this 15 or 20,000 rupees, every fifth concert you're going to be paying the maker about 800 rupees to 1,000 rupees to change that black spot. Okay. Then after about a year or two, you're going to again get the skin replaced, which is going to cost you about 4,000 rupees. So general bandwidth, there are of course variables to this depending on where the maker is. As you mentioned about the isolated circuit makers are because of the interaction with Brahmins, how the new generation cope up with it? Yes, I think the new generation, many of them are going into other professions, but many of them are also in this profession, or shall we say, have dual professions. And I think there's also a change in nature between generations on how they see their interactions and how much they've accepted as a norm. Also the fact that society has changed to some extent, and so there is certain greater empowerment among the younger musicians to state their demands or to say certain things with great forcefulness, or but yet certain lines. But again, I said there are always lines, right? Because of their kind of isolated cultural circle, there is only so much you can put. So some of them go to other professions, and I think it's a good thing. I think it's an excellent thing, actually, that many of them feel that they need to go to another profession. And so I think this is also going to change. But I think the pride in that traditional work that they still have, at least in the specific families that make the mridangam, will also result in some of them continuing in some way or manner in this profession.
The next question. This one. Yeah.
What's a trigger starting point for you? It is very simple. I read the chapter on caste, which I had written in Southern music. And I said, oh my God, I'm caste blind. Because when I read the chapter, it talks about caste on the performance stage, and completely forgot about everything else beyond the performance stage. And I actually wrote one paragraph first. I've said this before in the early days of the book launch, that I first wrote a paragraph. One paragraph about mridangam makers. And when I wrote that paragraph, the first thing that struck me is I know nothing. I could always go and write that paragraph. I didn't know about their culture. I didn't know about where they came from. I don't know why they're making the mridangam. I don't know how they make it. Nothing. So I took it out. And I said, no, let this big book go without it, because I will be lying to myself. I will just try to be correct if I added that paragraph. That's all I was trying to do. That was the trigger for this possibility. It took me a long time to actually do. I mean, a chance I would be happy to do once. I think most of you know that fieldwork where magic is, and it's almost like being like a high, because you're learning so much through that whole process. And every time you've had an interview, you're looking to it. You see so many things about your own perception, relearning it, erasing, debaggaging, learning. I could have gone on, but at some point I had to say, stop and say, let's put this all down into a story. Yes, answer is yes. Not just the mridangam maker, every instrument maker. Lockdown from March, we've been involved in some work in terms of supporting artists, and I'm using artists in a broad sense, which includes mridangam makers, artists, people who have put up stages, lightmen, mridangam makers, completely destroyed. I mean, months and months of no work. The other thing is things half done, just lying in their homes. Mridangam players not coming to pick it up because, one, of course, lockdown. Two is also the mridangam player had no concerts. There's no income coming there to go and pay for this. So he would rather just keep a half-done mridangam there. So yes, it has been actually a very, very difficult time for mridangam makers. And from our foundation, we have worked with and shared with about 50 mridangam makers in mainly Tamil Nadu, some in Andhra, through this period. The people in Kerala have basically said they are fine. They've actually told us multiple times, don't worry about us, we are fine. But the others have struggled, especially, also the boys who work in the shop, who are just who just started off, all of them are struggling. Do the government benefits? None. Problems. No social support. So that's something we've been working on. So this also answers another question that came about tangible changes in their life. So this is something that we have just started working on for a few months. It's a long battle, but we will see what we can do. There is no health insurance benefit. There is no retirement benefit. There's nothing for them. There is, in terms of those. Can you hear me now? I think there was a break in between. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Chandan, can you hear? Okay. So
I can hear
Yeah,
you.
sometimes they do it on roadside. Yeah, they do work on the roadside, skin work on the roadsides. Of course, then they are tormented by the police. There are cases where mridangam makers have been raided. The tigers, they are with buffalo skin, cow skin trouble. So, if anything, the government has been only a nuisance in their lives. There's been hardly any support. Take another question. Yeah. Is
Yes.
discrimination by caste also true for gut-stringed instruments in the past, before the time metal sings? It's a very good question. I am not. I think the difference here is when is it gut, when is it a string, right? And I think the moment it became string, there is a lot of hiding of that. For example, making of that skin. Of course, who would have made it? Those would have been people who work in the abattoir, who are primarily from the Dalit community. But once it became a string, once it became that idea of tonality, then again it becomes something that I'm willing to handle, I'm willing to touch, because now in my perception, it's a body of sound. It is not a body. So yes, there definitely was made by caste privilege to the time. The makers of both the parai and mridanga are proud from them. I hear your opinion on the dynamics of these two instruments. Yeah, actually, this is something that Toltirma Valavan, who came for the launch of the book, actually spoke about. And he made a very insightful comment. And he said, when I spoke to Krishna about this book, and when I, read about the situation of mridangam makers, I thought to myself, if the situation of the mridangam is like this, what would be the position of the parai? For those who don't know what the parai is a percussion instrument made of buffalo skin with a frame, single-sided, played and made by the Dalit community. It's extremely marginalized because it is often played during death ceremonies and funerals, and therefore, the kind of stigma there is, and I know stories of how they are not allowed to keep it even next to a tea shop or outside a house, because people say, "Do you want death to come to my house by keeping your instrument?" So the marginalization is tremendous. So it is worse, and this is where you must understand. But there is caste operates in this ugly aspirational way also. So for the mridangam makers, making the mridangam for a Brahmin or an upper caste art form is also a socially aspirational aspect. They differentiate themselves from the other laborers or workers around their homes, because, like one person said, we work in the Ayurveda. She actually told me this. She said when she got married, all her family were very happy because my husband worked in the Ayurveda. They didn't know what work he did. So this whole idea that because you're making mridangam, because you're an occupation that is, within quotes, servicing a certain caste privileged community, means that you are differentiating yourself, is the ugliness of caste pressure from all directions. And that's the whole, that creates a certain normalization, that could create certain acceptance of caste violence as being fine, acceptable, because it provides me a better social status. Are there any efforts being made to eliminate caste between Muslim? Well, this is, well, how does one answer this question? uh, uh, I mean, I'd like to say that I think this book is part of that whole process, isn't it? That somewhere engaging with this, I think we are all part of this process. And I do think that there has been robust, apart from the usual noises that you hear in public domain, keeping that aside, I think it has been wonderful for me when young mridangam players have called me and said, it's changed my relationship with the mridangam maker for me. Sometimes, we always discuss this. What is change? What is the barometer for change? One is, the barometer in such situation must be the people who are making it, the maker should come and say things has changed, and then things have changed, not you and me. One. Two, if it even changes one relationship, if it even changes one contact, then that's a beginning for a larger change. And I would like to believe, and from what I've heard, there have been changes in relationships. There have been people, even senior mridangam makers, mridangam players, asking mridangam makers about their homes, about their history. They say, I want to know. It's okay if it is triggered by this book or by shall we say, the politicization of this book. It's fine. As long as it gets to that, then I think we are seeing movement. We are seeing some mutual respect. And that translates then to many other things. Economic benefits also cannot come from charity. That's the other thing, right? I mean, there are mridangam players, for example, who are very generous within quotes. That word, even that expression, as I said it, came out very badly, right? Didn't it? Of course it did. So that doesn't change the inequality. So the equality is it a sharing, is in the relationship. So I think those kind of things will evolve, and I'd like to believe that in some way this book has made a mark. And it's not just about the mridangam maker, isn't it? It's about many other spheres of activities, each of us have our little spheres where these interactions are happening. And if this, shall we say, imbues those relationships, influences those contacts, then I think things will change. Any thoughts on producing a document, mridangam makers? No, not for now. There are many short films that you will see on YouTube. I've referred about it in my book, and I must say they're all deeply problematic because the maker is fundamentally invisible in every one of those short films that you see. Therefore, a documentary, I don't know. It's a good idea, but it's a completely different domain of creative work. Well, again, the question is, maybe a mridangam maker should make a film on mridangam making. That would be something. Mridangams being made with animal skin substitutes. Now, that's yes. Now, in fact, in Bangalore, there is one person who has made environmentally friendly mridangams. What it's called, by the way. As I say it, I see all the problems in that expression. So, replacement of hide, that's often talked about, and usually is talked about because of the problem of purity. Because Brahmins are unable to reconcile the two and unable to defend this position, somewhere this seems to be the best way to find synthetic replacements. The ones I've heard, this is my personal opinion, others can have other opinions, is I still don't believe, first of all, aesthetically, sonically, the replacements are really give us the feeling of the hide-made mridangam. This is my personal observation. Others may have other opinions. But there are fundamental questions. You cannot have environmentalism without social justice. We all know this. So we have to ask the question, why are we replacing? So if you're replacing to retain our sense of purity, it's absolutely violent. That's completely unacceptable. But there are multiple questions. Now, all these years, you refuse to make the mridangam. Why? Because it is made out of hide. So now we upper caste people want to make mridangams in synthetic form because we are happy dealing with synthetic and destroy families and a tradition of making. That's social and political violence. That's economic violence. So these are the questions we should be asking. Is this change going to then again go back to the makers who are going to be making the instrument? Are they part of the ideational process of the making? They are the experts in this domain. Another thing I want to say, they are the experts in this domain. Why are the experts not working on this? Why is everybody else, the amateur, the player, working on this? Right? So we have to complicate this a little bit more than just say, let's stop killing using cow skin or buffalo skin. I think we have to complicate this discussion.
Same thing. No. She's repeating the question.
Okay. Could you clarify if tuning with the stones and sticks is based on whether the instrument accompanies male? The stick and the stone, it's called the kallu and the pullu in Tamil. That's got nothing to do with male or female. So let me explain to you that the okay, it's debatable, and I debated in the book, is that the size of the frame of the mridangam is often also related to the pitch range of the mridangam. Now, is it really related? Is of course a physics question, which is there in the book, by the way. Now, the tuning is done with a round pebble usually and a small piece of wood. The tuning method is the same, irrespective of whether the pitch range of the mridangam is for a female voice or a male voice. That doesn't change. When you see them hitting the frame of the mridangam from top, okay, it means that the pitch will go up, will increase, which means that it will tighten. If you see them hitting it from below, opposite will happen. Irrespective of what pitch that mridangam is tuned to. Has the current beef ban affected all the mridangam making sector? Luckily, in the state of Chennai, state of Tamil Nadu, there is no beef ban problem. Luckily, in Kerala, there is no beef ban problem. I don't know how it is in Karnataka as such at that time, but I can tell you that they were all getting their skin. Many times they got the cow skin probably from Tamil Nadu also. So therefore, that was not a problem. So that is not. In fact, I visited the abattoir when there was this. I remember going to the abattoir, and I remember that's the only thing I didn't video film because I was nervous about taking camera. This controversy was erupting, and some states had banned. I think Maharashtra had then banned beef at that point, and I was worried about taking camera. And who contact for buying said, my friend said, why do you camera? I know I was nervous. He said, why do you bring? We have no problems. You can video what you want.
Krishna, I had just one question which perhaps follows from what you just said. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
This
yes,
is
I
the
can. Go ahead.
Question, and we'll close with this. Sorry, we have overstepped your time. Krishna, if you just see, there's a knowledge system and it has an ethical imagination, and if the Carnatic music in the knowledge system and the ethical imagination has not allowed for the recognition of the makers, either tacitly or expressly, and you have the knowledge of the makers. What is the ethical imagination there, either in the art form or in the way the practitioners have viewed their relationship with the users of their instruments? I mean, you gave an anecdote about this person who says the instruments enter the deity's room, but not us.
I mean, we are now.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. You're actually using a term that's an important term and which is rarely used in the world of art, which is ethical, right? I mean, the world of art, I mean, everybody, including the receiver and the producer of it, right? So the idea that is art experience an ethical experience? Suppose we ask that fundamental question,
Yes.
So how much of your experience of art needs to be ethical or needs to be problematized by the idea of ethical imagination? Now, fundamentally, we have not kept these two discourses together. So therefore, to the world of music making, this the idea of ethics or the ethical imagination does not exist. It is transactional, right? So it is only seen as a transactional thing, and everything else operates in the normalized domain of social being, right? So the other problem is also, which is a fundamental problem of most privileged forms, is the moment I enter that domain of ethical imagination, how much of what I own, which includes the creative spirit, becomes sullied. Now, I don't want that sullied. Neither does the listener want that sullied. The listener doesn't want to go to an auditorium and think of a bleeding cow.
Yes.
Right? Because you're part of the same community, right? So therefore, this shall we say erasure of the world of ethics from the world of experience, which is why I go back to the idea is that we, whether it's in anthropology or in sociology, we never often look at the experience being the domain where it's most operative.
Yes.
And we never bring the ethical into that conversation. We keep this as a social political happening, and we see that as an experientially aesthetic output. It cannot be a separate thing. And they both meet in the experience. And the moment you problematize the experience, then you have some ethical imagination happening. But we would not allow that to happen. Let's just turn this on its head before I close. Look at what happens to our perception. I'm talking about, again, the same privileged world, of our experience of that which is already socially sullied. Now, where is there ethical imagination there? So when we look at an art from a marginalized community, there too it doesn't exist, because there the domain in operation is again only the social domain. So as we operate in the same way, using the same lens within and outside.
Thank you, Krishna. I mean, you've just closed on a question that requires another session altogether, but thank you very much for the talk and the really engaged interaction with our students. Hope to have you back with us again with the new book.
Thank you.
Sometime soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us. It was wonderful to be with all of you. Thank you.